Scott. I am a public engagement coordinator with the Oregon Water Resources Department. For the purposes of this evening, I'm going to be your facilitator. I'm going to ask that folks hold their questions until the end of the meeting. We've got an agenda item specifically for question and answer. And anything we can't answer this evening, we're going to capture on that board over there, and we're going to get those answers back to you. We are going to be recording this meeting, so it's recording the presenters, not the audience. So no worries on that front, but we want to make sure that we have this as an available resource for you folks after today. If you want to rewatch the presentation, it'll be available on our website. The PowerPoint will be available on our website. All the printed materials are also going to be available, so all of this information will be available after tonight's meeting. So just a few ground rules there, and I'm going to kick it off with some introductions of Oregon Water Resources staff that are here this evening. So I'm going to ask you guys to come up here and introduce yourselves and your positions.
Hi there, my name is Kate Tiller, and I'm Assistant Water Master in District 10.
Hi, my name is Dallas Sonolos, and I'm the Water Master for District 10.
I'm Miguel, Water Resources Department out of Salem. I'm Acting Deputy Director for Water Management for the agency.
My name is Tim Seymour. I'm the Assistant Manager for the groundwater section at the Water Resources Department.
Kelly Mines, I am the Rural Writer, Rural Coordinator, and Policy Analyst for the Oregon Department of Water Resources.
Hi everyone, I'm Jason Street. I'm the East Region Manager for Water Resources Department, and I'm out of Baker City.
All right, perfect. So we'll go ahead and transition over to our agenda for this evening. So we just did our welcome and our introductions, went over a couple ground rules. Next, we're going to transition over to why a groundwater study was done and what did we find. We're going to then move to the groundwater management options. We're going to move to what is classification, and then we'll move to that Q&A session, and then we'll just have a couple closing remarks. So we'll move it on to our first presenter.
Thanks, Alexandria. So my name is Tim Seymour, like I said. I'm the Assistant Manager for the groundwater section. And my section of the department is focused on understanding groundwater systems within Oregon, and then helping the department make decisions about how to manage that effectively. So to step back a little bit, back in the early 2000s, as you can see by this hydrograph, we started to notice some groundwater declines within the Harney Basin. And these groundwater declines on this hydrograph are primarily from the Weaver Springs area down in the lowlands outside of Burns. And so over time, into 2010, 2015, we were really seeing steep groundwater declines, right? So you've got the 4,100 foot mark there, and that's groundwater level elevation above sea level. And then you're talking 20 feet, 40 feet, another 60 feet, and this trend was continuing on. And so we realized that we really needed to get ahead of this problem and try to quantify what the situation was and start to address it. And so we collaborated with the U.S. Geologic Survey, and the USGS came in and helped us perform a cooperative basin study. The intent of that basin study was really to quantify how groundwater flows within the Harney Basin. And the intent was to then be able to make holistic management decisions about groundwater throughout the basin. To do this, we really needed to form a conceptual model for how groundwater flows throughout the basin. And then also, we wanted to put together a model for modeling how that groundwater flows within the basin. And so, over the course of 6 years, we worked on this groundwater study. So if we go to the next slide, as you can see here on this map, in the orange area, we have the Harney Basin. So we're here up in Seneca, just inside Grant County. And for the purposes of this meeting, what we're really going to be focusing on is that section of the basin. But the study area was everything here in orange. And as part of that study, we were really focused on 3 watersheds: the Silver River, Silver Creek, and the Donner and Blitzen. And those 3 watersheds make up that Harney Basin. So, in order to kick off the groundwater study, we went through a rulemaking process to update our basin program rules for the Harney Basin. And when we did that, out of that came the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern. And in that area, as part of that process, the department classified that area and water within that area, specifically groundwater within that area, for exempt uses only. So that means that we were not going to approve any applications for groundwater permits. So exempt uses, things like domestic use, stock watering, watering of up to ½ an acre of lawn or garden would be allowed, but any new applications for permits would be denied. And the goal there was to get ahead of the problem and prevent further allocation of groundwater when we knew we had significant groundwater declines going on within the basin, right? So prevent the situation from getting worse. So that was the intent of the study, and that's the study area. So if you go to the next slide, Alexandria, out of that process, it took 6 years, and in 2021 and 2022, we published 6 reports and 2 fact sheets with the USGS. And those reports are all available online, available to you. If you would like a copy of them, we can provide them to you in hard copy form, just let us know. But these reports were really to sum up all of the information that we learned throughout the study. We have another, I believe, 2 reports coming, and those will be on the groundwater model. So the USGS is finishing up the groundwater model and running it through peer review. And once they have done that, we'll have a model that will help us understand how changes in groundwater pumping within the basin will affect the overall system. So, as part of these reports, a couple of outcomes from it. The first was we divided up the basin into 3 main sections, and as you'll notice, they're pretty close to the same watersheds that were in the previous map. So we've got the north, the west, and the south. The second part was we divided the basin up into uplands and lowlands. So the lowlands are inside the yellow squiggly line, and that's primarily, as you can see from the previous slide, it matches up fairly closely with the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern. That's where the bulk of groundwater pumping is, it's where the bulk of that irrigation use is. And then we have the upland areas, which are outside that yellow squiggly line. The upland areas are primarily areas of recharge for the entire basin. So that's where the majority of precipitation comes down in the form of either rain or snowfall, and where the groundwater system is essentially recharged and reloaded with new water. So that's how we broke up the basin into different pieces. And again, for the purpose of this meeting, we're really focused on that north area, and we're in the uplands. And that's important because that will help us better understand what the groundwater budget is here in the uplands in this area. So if we go on to the next slide, there were 3 key takeaways that I wanted to present today from the groundwater study. The first is that most of the Harney Basin groundwater is ancient. And when I say ancient, I mean 5,000 to 3,000 years ago is when it was put in the ground. So it's old. Modern groundwater, so groundwater that's recharged after 1953, is limited to a thin, shallow zone beneath the recharge areas. So primarily in uplands, and then in areas in the lowlands where there is flow from streams. The second thing is that Harney Basin groundwater flows in a single hydraulically connected system. So throughout the basin, there are no known impermeable zones that prevent groundwater flow. So groundwater can flow from here in Seneca all the way down to the Harney Lake. And it can do that unimpeded, but it will take a very, very, very long time, as we can see by the age of the groundwater. And then the third takeaway, which is probably the most important for this area, is that the Harney Basin groundwater budget balances in the uplands, but it doesn't balance in the lowlands, and it doesn't balance to the tune of 110,000 acre-feet per year. That's a lot of water. And so the concern is that as we continue to pump groundwater and use 110,000 acre-feet more than what is coming back into the system, we're depleting the groundwater resource. So if we go to the next slide, we'll drill into this water budget just a little bit more. So this slide highlights how precipitation and snowmelt come into the uplands primarily, and the size of the arrow matches up with the quantities of either recharge or discharge. Blue is recharge, so that's water coming into the system. Red is discharge, and that's water going out of the system. So much like your personal budget, money comes in when you get a paycheck, money goes out when you spend it at the grocery store. It's the same sort of thing here. So for the uplands, which again is where we are here in Grant County, around the Seneca area, that little sliver that I showed in orange on the map, precipitation and snowmelt make up about 288,000 acre-feet per year, and streams and springs discharge about 239,000 acre-feet per year. Groundwater flow, so that's actual water that soaks into the ground and then moves through the ground down into the lowlands, makes up the difference at about 49,000 acre-feet. Down in the lowlands, we have streams, natural floodwater, lakes, that bring in about 59,000 acre-feet. We've got surface water irrigation. So when we use surface water, primarily through flood irrigation down in the lowlands, that some of that recharges groundwater to the tune of about 57,000 acre-feet per year. And then groundwater irrigation and non-irrigation pumpage, so where people are irrigating with groundwater and they're putting on more than what the plants can use. Whatever they put on beyond that soaks back into the ground and becomes groundwater again. So if we add all those numbers up, we can then do a balance calculation down here. So as I said, 288 is equivalent to what's going out, and this is in balance. But here, in the discharge, we have pumpage at 152,000 acre-feet, and we have evapotranspiration, springs and lakes generating about 128,000 acre-feet of discharge per year. And when I say evapotranspiration, what I mean is evaporation and transpiration. So evaporation being water evaporating into the air, transpiration being plants using that water. And certain plants are able to tap into the groundwater system, things like greasewood, and they use water, and as they use water, it evaporates. Or it transpires is the correct term. So evapotranspiration makes up that piece of it. So again, we have a lowland groundwater budget that's significantly out of balance. And if we go to the next slide, here we've got the actual numbers in a spreadsheet, as you would, just like your personal budget. So we're in the north and in the uplands. So upland recharge is about 86,000 acre-feet per year on average, and upland discharge is about 86,000 acre-feet per year. In the rest of the basin, and that's then, this is all for the uplands, right? So we then have uplands in the south, and we have uplands in the west. The south being primarily the Steens, the west being primarily the Silver Creek region. And so all of the uplands balance out to zero. The concern is that because we have such a large deficit in the lowlands, any additional pumping that would happen in the uplands would capture water that is going to be going to the lowlands and would further put the budget out of balance. And any additional usage in the uplands would put the uplands water budget out of balance. And so that's why we're here today to talk to you. So next I'm going to turn it over to Ivan. And I think we can go to the next slide. Ivan's going to talk about our groundwater management options and how we try to address this overall problem.
So again, good evening, everybody. Ivan Gall with the Water Resources Department. I work out of our Salem office, and years ago was a groundwater scientist by training, so I understand some of what Tim was talking about here tonight. My part of the presentation this evening is to talk kind of generically about different management options for groundwater that the state has. And those management options come to the department, they're tools basically, through water laws that have been passed by the legislature over the decades, and then rules that have been adopted by our Water Resources Commission. So I'll walk through that and then turn it over for Kelly to kind of wrap things up. We have a number of regulatory groundwater control tools and management tools. We flip those words around all the time. The first one here is withdrawal of unappropriated waters. So in an area where we have over-allocated groundwater, too much, one of the options would be to adopt rules that withdraw the remaining groundwater from further appropriation. It could be from a finite amount of further appropriation, like permitted rights and perhaps leaving exempt uses, or it could be in totality. We could adopt rules, or the commission would adopt rules that basically say the remaining groundwater resources in this area are withdrawn from further appropriation or use. We want to save that groundwater that's there for the existing groundwater users that are already using it. So that's one of the tools that can be used. What does it control? It really is a future groundwater use or forward-looking type tool. It doesn't affect any exempt wells. It doesn't affect any permitted wells or any existing uses of groundwater. All it does is focus on potential future uses if folks want to do any development in that area. The second management tool is classification of water, and that's really what we'll be focusing more time on tonight and what is relevant to this part of Grant County here. So it's a classification or reclassification of waters. Could be surface water, could be groundwater, could be both, to the highest and best use and quantities of use for the future. Again, it's a forward-looking tool. A classification process doesn't impact anybody's stock wells or domestic wells or groundwater wells that have water rights on them. It's a forward-looking tool that says, from today, when these rules are adopted, we're only going to allow certain uses of groundwater in this geographic area. Next one is the serious water management problem area, lovingly called a SWAMPA. It is really just a tool to require water users, either surface water users or groundwater users, depending on what the management issue is there, to measure their water use and report that water use to the department. So Dally Swindlehurst back here, he's your water master. He already has the authority through statute and rule to require a water user to measure their water use. And until this latest legislative session, though, we didn't have any authority to require you to report the water use. So if we want to come out and see how much water you've used, we got to come out and read the flow meter, basically. So the SWAMPA tool allows us in an area where we have to do a lot of management, we can require measurement of water use and reporting of water use. The only serious water management problem area that we have in Oregon is in the Walla Walla subbasin, right up on the Oregon-Washington border. We have a series of basalt aquifer systems up there. There's been groundwater development in those aquifer systems over the decades. Water levels are going down at a fairly good pace. And so we've stopped allocation of water in those basalt aquifer systems. And to understand the relationship between groundwater use and water level trends over time, we've required those basalt system users to install flow meters on their wells and report that water use to the department once per year. So again, that's the only example of a serious water management problem area we have in Oregon today. The next tool is a critical groundwater area designation. And this is a tool that can have impacts on existing groundwater users today. So again, the withdrawal and the classification are kind of forward-looking tools. The serious water management problem area is all about measurement and data reporting. A critical groundwater area can effectively curtail or shut off existing groundwater users in a particular area where we have concerns about these groundwater level declines. We have, Tim, what, 6 or 7 critical groundwater areas? 7 critical groundwater areas that have been designated in Oregon so far. Most of those tend to be focused on the basalt aquifer system, which are prone to overdraft and groundwater level declines. In a few of those, in the Umatilla Basin, up in Umatilla County and Morrow County, actual curtailment of existing groundwater rights has occurred in order to save the remaining groundwater in those systems for the senior water rights in those systems. Otherwise, we would eventually, with time, pump them dry and everybody would be out of water. Groundwater mitigation area is a unique one. Right now, the only law and rules in the state point to the Deschutes Basin for that. So in order to get a new groundwater right within large portions of the Deschutes Basin, you have to mitigate for the impacts of that new groundwater right on the lower Deschutes River. And there's a water bank set up, if you will, to buy credits in order to get that mitigation. So that again is unique to the Deschutes Basin and not really part of tonight's discussion. Next slide, thank you. Another tool that we have, over the last couple of decades, many of the groundwater rights that have been issued contain permit conditions. These conditions range from anything install a flow meter and maintain that flow meter to what we call decline conditions. And we recognized that we had limited data in some basins around the state, so we went ahead and issued groundwater rights, but we tried to put a safety valve in that permit. And some of the conditions were somewhat complicated, but an example of one of those decline conditions is that if your groundwater level declines 25 feet or more from an established reference level over any period of time, then your groundwater use for that water right has to be slowed down or shut off until the groundwater level recovers back up above that 25-foot threshold there. And so regulating on permit conditions is another way to do some management of groundwater use in parts of the state. Another tool that we have is part of Oregon's Groundwater Act there, are voluntary agreements. So these are agreements that groundwater users who pump from the same aquifer system or groundwater reservoir can work together and enter into a voluntary agreement amongst themselves and amongst the Water Resources Commission to voluntarily start slowing down and cutting back on groundwater pumping. That does also control existing uses and can be a very handy tool. We have no examples of that in Oregon to this day. We just haven't used that tool at all. Most people are going to find it hard to cut back voluntarily, or at least have historically, and so that tool hasn't been used. We are working in Harney County with a CREP program to pair up state funds and federal dollars to get some voluntary reductions in groundwater use in that part of the basin where these declines are going on. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what a classification is here, and I want to cover what the classification is and kind of the rule process to get us there, and then Kelly will build on that some more. Next slide. So you'll see ORS on a few of our slides. That's Oregon Revised Statute. It's just law. And our division of law there is 536-340. So this particular water law authorizes the commission to classify water within a basin to the highest and best use and quantity of use. And we hit that on one of the earlier slides there. What does that do? Well, it specifies the types and quantities of use that will be allowed. And again, we're talking groundwater here. It affects future uses only, so no one with existing groundwater rights or exempt wells is impacted in any way. And the last bullet there does not affect current users or uses. This is the process that was used back in 2016 to create the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern. So that's the patch or boundary that Tim showed you in several of those slides. We realized we had over-allocated in the lowlands, in and around Burns and the Harney Valley there. So we wanted a tool to stop issuing groundwater rights, and that's what this classification did down in that part of the basin there. In order to get to those rules in 2016, we go through a fairly formal rule process, and we're starting that process again with the Division 512 rules, which are the rules that deal with the Mount Hood Lake administrative basin there. We have convened a RAC so far for our first Rule Advisory Committee meeting. Members of the Rule Advisory Committee are selected by the department. We're looking for broad representation across the basin, geographically, expertise, representation from different industries. So we try and involve city governments, county governments, tribal governments, groundwater users, conservation groups, folks that like fishing and in-stream uses, folks that like out-of-stream uses, things like that, trying to get broad representation. We are looking to get various perspectives to make sure that the rules we develop are going to be fair, that they're clear, that they're workable. And when I say fair, keep in mind that Oregon water law really isn't fair. It's set up to protect the senior users out there. In times of shortage, we follow the prior appropriation doctrine. Senior users get the water and junior users get regulated off. And that's been an age-old practice in the state going back over 100 years. Let's see, a little bit more on RAC and RAC members. RAC members are not required to reach a consensus. They're not obligated to vote. We're really looking for input, perspective on issues. Do the rules provide clarity to you? Are there better ways to word things? And just provide that quality input back to the department to make sure that the process is good there. Rule Advisory Committee meetings are open to the public. Usually, almost always now, we set up the agenda where the Rule Advisory Committee goes through their business. The public's welcome to sit in and listen to that, and then at the end, we'll have a public comment period where members of the public can ask questions or provide their input based on what they've heard and what they've read in the draft rules so far. I think that's it. Next slide. So now starting to kind of focus in specific to the Harney Basin study area, which includes the uplands here in Grant County. Why are we talking about a classification process? Tim touched on it. Grant County sits in the uplands. That's a primary source of recharge for the lowlands where the bulk of the groundwater pumping is occurring. And so capture of water by wells up here is going to eventually, long periods of time here, reduce the amount of water that gets down to the lower basin. Some of the groundwater that recharges here in the uplands fairly quickly ends up discharging to the stream. So you've got the Sylvies River outside of town here. Not a lot of flow in there, but it's not dry either. And in this time of year, we don't have glaciers up here melting, the snow's long gone. Largely what we're seeing is groundwater influence coming in there. And that's a little bit of recharge that was infiltrated into the shallow aquifer system and is discharging to maintain these lower base flows there. So, again, summarizing kind of why we're concerned and why we feel there's a need for classification. We have broad areas in the lowlands, the Greater Harney Valley groundwater area of concern where groundwater levels are declining. We have measured water levels in hundreds of wells during the study. We continue to measure water levels in wells, now dozens of them in the basin, and are tracking these longer term trends. And in order to try and stabilize groundwater levels or slow that rate of decline, we will be working towards other management tools in that part of the basin. We have reports of dry wells down there. We've had dry well complaints around the state for the last 3 years. Some basins much worse than others, but a combination of drought and over-pumping some of our aquifer systems has started to impact other wells, agricultural wells, domestic wells, different ones there. the state actually has a funding program in place now to help low-income folks in areas hit by drought or fire and having problems with domestic wells there. And then one of the key results of the study that was done with us in the USGS is that groundwater in the area is shown to be over-allocated. So that's that water budget slide that Tim talked to. We're withdrawing more water than we're putting into the system each year. So the department has a couple decision points, and these are the types of things that members of the Rural Advisory Committee or the public can provide input on. Really quickly here, we need to figure out what's the boundary of this classification area going to look like, and what types of uses of groundwater will we allow looking forward within this area of classification there. How do we go about defining boundaries? Well, there's different ways we can do that. We can talk about administrative boundaries, Grant County, Harney County, townships, ranges, sections. Geological boundaries. In some cases it makes sense to look at geological units. I talked earlier about the serious water management problem area in the Walla Walla subbasin. We have real concerns there about the basalt aquifer system. So we're looking at a series of basalt lava flows there, different aquifers kind of stacked on top of one another. We can use geology to help us characterize an area there. And then hydrological boundaries. Sometimes it makes sense to take in a whole drainage basin, like the whole drainage basin of the Donner and Blitzen River as an example, or the Silvies River drainage basin. So those are different ways that boundaries can be established for a classification area. What about the types of water use that could be allowed going forward? Do we limit it to just exempt groundwater uses only? We'll talk about those in detail and what those are. Should we maintain some flexibility for what we call limited licenses? So these are short-term authorizations for somebody in the community to do something unique. You need construction water for a big road project. You need construction water for a solar farm. Maybe you need to build a new airport. You need construction water for that. If there's a burn area and we need to establish riparian habitat, can we issue a limited license to water the new vegetation to get it established so it takes off on its own and we can speed up the process there. So those are some of the different types of uses and flexibilities that can be built into that process. So we'll have a couple slides here just to throw out, different boundaries. What you're looking at here is a red box that is largely around the whole Malheur Lake Administrative Basin. So that encompasses most of Harney County, a little bit of Lake County. I think there's a wee smidgen of Deschutes County, the uplands where we're at today, the Grant County, and I think we even drag in a little bit of Malheur County on the eastern boundary there down to the south. So you can have a boundary that's set up on that administrative basin. We can do county lines, again, break things up by township, range, and section, or take smaller portions of that, whatever makes sense. Dropping back to the rules that we adopted in 2016, the decision back then, based on the best available information that we had, was to throw a loop around what eventually became called the Greater Harney Valley Groundwater Area of Concern. Long acronym, sorry for that. And that's the kind of black hatchered pattern there that you see in the center of the orange blob. The orange blob is the boundaries of the study that we did with the U.S. Geological Survey. So we call that the Harney Basin study area, basically. And then again, you have that heavier black line, which was the administrative basin boundary that we talked about on the previous slide there. Next slide. So the boundaries originally for the groundwater area of concern back in 2016 were drawn to, again, get a loop around the area of substantial groundwater development, which today we call kind of in the lowlands area down there. That boundary was drawn based on the U.S. Geological Survey, what we call hydrologic unit codes. So they're surface area mapping tools that cover basins and really break a large basin like Silver Creek or the Silvies River into subbasins. And a combination of those was used back in 2016 to create that black hatchet pattern. And again, that was largely due to the fact that that's where most of the development had occurred, most of our data existed, and where we were having the declines going on. And again, that area, since 2016, has been classified for exempt uses only. So I said earlier, we'll talk about what exempt uses mean. We can spend a minute or two here doing that. In Oregon, you can use some groundwater without having to apply for a water right or a permit. And those are exempted, if you will, from the permitting requirement. And we've listed the main ones here. Stock water is exempt, so whether you're going to give water to 1 cow or 1,000 cows, you don't need a water right for that. Can't waste it. It should be a reasonably efficient use, but stock water is exempt. You can water a lawn or non-commercial garden up to a ½ acre in size. Single or group domestic purposes, up to 15,000 gallons a day. So, you know, a single family residence is going to use probably 400 to 500 gallons a day. We've had some 30-home developments go in on a well system that can stay within that 15,000 gallons a day limitation there. So that's a group or single domestic exemption there that exists as well. Downhole heat exchange purposes. So some folks have groundwater-based heat pump systems, and you can use groundwater for that. And then there's a single industrial or commercial use up to 5,000 gallons per day. And you get all of these. So if you have some stock on your place, you've got a home on your place, and you've got a business on your place, you get to use all of these. They're additive. But if you don't have a business or an industrial use, you can't count the 5,000 gallons a day for some additional irrigation for your garden or something. And I think that's the last one for me. Yeah, so I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, and then we'll be happy to sit here and take questions.
Hello, everybody. So again, my name is Kelly Mines. I'm the rule writer and the rule coordinator for the department. So what that means, I've been just told you that classification is done through the rulemaking process. So my job is to work with the very smart groundwater scientists and to corral them into one lane and follow this very stringent rulemaking process that the Oregon State Legislature requires the department to do. So I'm going to kind of walk you through generally what that looks like. And so starting from, do we have the laser pointer?
Oh, sorry.
Well, not the laser pointer. All right.
And Kelly, I think the mic a little higher.
Okay, thank you, Evan. All right, so starting from the very top here. So, beginning of the rule-making process, internally, the department develops draft rules. Oftentimes, these rules require specific language that needs to be written within the draft rules. So, for example, Ivan just talked about classification. Within the rule language, we define the boundary, and we also need to define the types of use that we are classifying within that boundary. So that's an example of rule writing language that the department needs to write. From there, as I've explained, we then form the Rules Advisory Committee, or the RAC. And we have started doing that for the Division 512, the Harney Basin Division 512 rulemaking process. We have formed a RAC of 32 people, consisting of all sorts of interests. And so what the RAC is supposed to be is it's supposed to be a group of people that are likely going to be affected by the rulemaking once they are adopted by our Water Resources Commission. And they are, the RAC that we have now consists of irrigators, business owners, domestic well users, state and local government agencies. And so the primary role of the Rules Advisory RAC, the Rules Advisory Committee, or the RAC, is to, one, help us with what we call the physical impact statement. So when we adopt these rules, how is this going to affect, for example, the local economy? How is this going to affect irrigators? And they provide that input. And two, they also provide input on the actual rule language that we are drafting. So we work together with the RAC to kind of form what we all agree on is a fair set of rules, as Beckman said. So that consists of multiple meetings that we go throughout a period of time. So for this Division 512 rulemaking, we are doing 5 different RACs. The first one was in April. The next one is coming up in 2 weeks, August 29th, at the Hardy County Community Center from 1 to 5 p.m. The public is welcome to join. We always have a public comment period at the ending where we like to listen to the public, and we also consider those comments as well. But, so once the Rules Advisory Committee is over, that process, we then begin what we call the official rulemaking process. It's called the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So I post the rules, the language, onto the Oregon Bulletin. I notify all affected parties, as well as I do press releases. And what that signals to the public that we are now accepting all forms of public comment. And so we have that go for a period of time. We receive written public comments. And then at the end of that public comment period, it's in that notice, I say it's going to end, for example, January 1st. At the end of that period, we then take all the public comments received, we go through them, we change the rules as needed based off the comments, and then we begin writing our, I skipped a step. During the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, we also hold public hearings, and so that is a opportunity for the public to come and give oral comments on our rules. So a good example of that, one rule writing I did was the Division 10 rules. We held public hearings. It was a rule set that affected all of Oregon. So we held public hearings from all across the state. And we took oral comment from citizens of Oregon. So once the notice and the public hearing period is over, we then begin drafting a staff report to our governing body, the Water Resources Commission. The staff report contains all of the comments that we received, our responses, the updated draft rules based off of the comments that we received from the public, and then we bring that report to the commission. We give a presentation, and then we ask the Water Resources Commission to vote to adopt these rules. If we get a yes vote, then those rules are officially adopted, and then we file it into the Oregon State Legislature, the Oregon Bulletin, and they become official rules. So, kind of a quick overview of our rulemaking process for Division 512. So we had our first Rules Advisory Committee, RAC number 1, back in April. And in between RAC number 2 and RAC number 1, we started developing initial draft rules. We went a little bit out of order with what as we usually follow the rulemaking process, because in 2016, our Division 512 rules required us to hold a RAC 2 years after the groundwater study.
1 year.
1 year?
1 year after.
Okay, thank you. 1 year after the groundwater study was posted, so we held that RAC. We developed initial draft rules. We are now in the Rules Advisory Committee. That's going to go through January of next year. We're going to notice the public comment, and then hopefully aim for adoption September of next year. So if you are not a part of the Rules Advisory Committee, there are many ways that you can engage with the process. The first one would be you may come in person or attend virtually to our second RAC, which is going to be on August 29th at the Hardy County Community Center from 1 to 5 p.m. From 4:30 to 5, we accept public comments. So that is the first way. Then the second way is during our public notification and public hearing process, you can either write written comments on the rules, and you can also attend public hearing. For this particular process, we're going to be doing the hearings here in Hardy County, in the Hardy Basin. So there will be more, we will advertise that and there'll be more opportunity to do written oral comment. So just generally, again, this is kind of a rulemaking timeline. We're doing our RAC process from April to January, and then from February to June, we'll be noticing those rules, doing our public hearing. July, we'll be developing that staff report to the Water Resources Commission, and looking to get this adopted in September 2024. Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ivan, and we're going to start taking some questions.
I'm curious, before we get started, Kelly was covering the rule advisory committee process. Have any of you served on a RAC before? Okay. How about questions?
So how's our aquifer here related to the one down in Kearney Basin?
It's different, and I'll speak in generalities because I wasn't part of the study team there, but the underlying geology varies between the uplands here and then as you work your way down to the lowlands. You guys would know better than I do. I'm not aware of any what I would call high-yielding wells up here. I haven't seen a center pivot up around Seneca. You have a very short growing season, obviously. But I think it's fair to say that you probably don't have the aquifer system that the lowlands have, that it's going to produce large yielding wells, you know, where you can drill a well and get 1,000 gallons a minute to run a 120-acre pivot or something. So, Tim, are you familiar with water level trends up here?
No.
I'm not either, and I apologize for that. On our website, we have a groundwater, what we call groundwater information system, and it's just an interactive map. It's like Google Maps. You can zoom into an area of interest, and there will be dots on there, and those are observation wells. I don't know how many obs wells we have up here in the upper basin and the uplands.
It's not, I will say it's not very many.
Yeah.
We do not see declines anywhere near what we see in the lowlands.
Yeah.
So, as I said, I spoke about the groundwater budget. We do not have the same concerns as the lowlands. We don't see the large groundwater declines. And for the most part, the budget is in balance. So recharge equals discharge.
Does that help answer your question? Yes, sir.
So a question in general, a lot of what we talk about is groundwater. Does this apply to surface water or surface water allocations at all, or just groundwater?
This is just groundwater is what we're talking about. I haven't reviewed the rules recently, but most of our basin program rules have already classified surface water for pretty much everything under the sun, with some rare exceptions depending on the basin you're in. So those uses, anything that's considered a normal beneficial use is typically allowed. What's different here, you know, you're in an arid part of the state, and frankly, most of Oregon anymore, surface water availability, like groundwater, has become very limited for traditional out-of-stream appropriations during the growing season. So there still may be some water available up here for storage rights, as an example, where you can get some water out of a small tributary for a stock pond or something. But the large uses for, say, a new irrigation project just aren't going to exist. The water's not there for it.
I guess follow-up question to that, the rules that you're looking to potentially make, would that have to do with potentially surface water, meaning someone that has surface water rights would then be looked at as going to be considered the same as groundwater rights, and if they draw a line in the sand and say you think after 1893 or whatever it is, would need to be reduced. Does it apply to surface water and groundwater, or would the rules just apply to groundwater?
The classification that we're talking about tonight is going to just focus on black groundwater, yeah. And, you know, again, from a practical perspective, I think the common approach, which is what we took down in the lower valley in 2016, was just to classify it for exempt uses only. And that didn't leave the door open for some of those special projects I said under the limited licenses. So we're probably going to revisit that when we get into the rules again. But again, the classification will focus only on groundwater. It won't affect anybody's decreed surface water rights up here or state issued surface water rights. Doesn't mess with the priority date of that at all.
And it wouldn't affect existing groundwater rights either, correct?
And it wouldn't affect existing groundwater rights either. So it's just basically saying we've identified that we've got a problem. Our water budget's out of balance. Our withdrawals exceed our deposits. And so we don't want to make that problem any worse. Let's stop issuing new permits. And I only know of one permit that's been issued in the upper basin here in the last several years, so there's just not much activity. Again, I think largely because the groundwater resource isn't here to be developed. So. Yes, sir.
Highest and best use, who decides that, or is it already decided?
The statutes speak to that a little bit, where there's mention in a couple of places, and by statutes I mean Oregon water law, that the commission under certain conditions can set aside or classify or prioritize, my words, say water for domestic purposes. Stock water is always one of those. Clearly, for most of us, at the end of the day, human health, animal health, those are going to be some of the highest needs out there. And so that's what that highest and best use gets at. I'm trying to think, I can't think of very many examples. We have drought policies and rules, so when there's a county drought declaration, sometimes uses can be set aside, but that hasn't been done in recent years to my knowledge. Yes, sir.
Are there not rules or regulations already in place that would allow you to balance the shortfall that you have now? I mean, why haven't you balanced?
Yeah, great question. And so I'll try and come up with a short answer, and we're going to jump back in time a few decades. I talked about the fact that there's 7 critical groundwater areas that have already been established in the state. Those were established prior to 1991 under some old water law that was changed in the 1991 legislative session. And so there's a new law on how to do a critical groundwater area process, which is the management tool to come in and rebalance things for existing groundwater rights that we've already issued. When that law was changed, the rules associated with that law were now out of date, and those rules were last updated in 1990, just a year earlier. We haven't established a critical groundwater area since the late 80s, early 1990s. And so we're in the process right now, Kelly and I, of updating another set of rules, what we call Division 10, that are modernizing and honoring the new statutes with the new rule process. So we have to go through a new rule process. We're actually going to be in Burns the end of September. The Water Resources Commission is going to come out and meet. So if you're interested, it's the last Thursday, Friday of the month in September. The commission will be meeting down in Burns, and we'll be bringing these draft rules to the commission and asking them to adopt them. And that will allow us then to establish new critical groundwater areas in the state. Part of the Division 512, so for the Malheur Lake Basin program, part of that rule update will include a critical groundwater area designation. But that's likely going to focus on the lowlands where all the groundwater use is at. There's no need to do anything up here because, as Tim said, your water budget's in balance up here. We just don't want to make the problem worse by coming up with new consumptive uses in the uplands here that are eventually going to have a negative impact on the lowlands down there. Does that get to the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir.
We have water rights both on the Sylvies and John Day.
Okay.
And I really know a lot about our water rights. But my question is, when we talk about priority dates, our old water rights, historic use, highest and best use and all that, and then we have this thing in Harney Basin, I just have to ask the question, of all the wells in that basin, how many were permitted wells and how many weren't?
It's a good question. To our knowledge, and when a water master drives down the road and looks for legal use and illegal or unauthorized use, we're usually looking at the field. It's hard to see a well. Sometimes it's easier with the power drops. You know, 3-phase power can stand out. But we're really focused on, does that field have a water right on it? And is the farmer using the right source of water from the field? Sometimes we get to the question, are they using the right well and the right groundwater source? I mentioned the Walla Walla subbasin. It's different than here, but I'll use it as an example. They have an alluvial aquifer, sands and gravels. That's one source of groundwater. And then they have these underlying basalt aquifers that are a separate source. So in that particular scenario, it really does matter which well you're using. There are numerous, I would say, and we don't know how many, wells that were drilled to cover existing groundwater rights that probably aren't up to date on their water right. But our main issue is tracking the acres that are being irrigated. We have found illegal use in the past, and Daly and his predecessor have gotten that under control. We go out and talk to folks, we look for voluntary compliance. If they don't comply, we have an enforcement process that we can start ramping up at that point in time. Yeah, there's certainly unauthorized wells. I'll stop there. So we recognize that as an issue. As we get into more details and more management in the lowlands down there, all of that stuff is going to become obvious, and folks will probably have to do water right transfers that will add these unauthorized wells onto their water rights so they can't use them if they want to continue to use them. Otherwise, Daly will have them shut off.
Just a trivia question. How many lakes obviously fill up by surface water coming from the watersheds? Question is, what is the effect of the most lakes on groundwater?
Great question, and it's an interesting story. So pre-development, before we showed up with three-phase power and nice well drilling machines and the ability to pump a lot of groundwater, the lakes were actually the discharge area for the groundwater flow system for most of it. So groundwater recharged in the uplands, recharged as an example on the alluvial fan where the Silvies River enters the valley there just outside of Burns. Same with Silver Creek. And all of that groundwater would get into the aquifer system and flow down. Groundwater, just like surface water, flows because of gravity. It's being pulled, pushed. And the lowest point in the basin, in the last few hundred years anyways, were the lakes. And groundwater would discharge up through those sediments. It would be sucked up by plants down there and transpired and consumed. And so that was the natural system. And there were some very early studies done. I think the earliest one was in the late 20s, early 30s. And the groundwater elevation data that the scientists were able to measure back then suggested that that was still occurring. Can we go back to the first slide of the hydrograph there? Over time, as we developed these wells and started consuming more groundwater, we created changes in that water table elevation and aquifer system. And you can see these data went back to the 1960s. It looks like things are pretty stable until about 1990, 1995. And then you see things start to dive off. What we have today, when you look at the basin on a map, a flat map, we can contour groundwater elevation just like you have a topographic map of topographic elevation there. And we see a big hole around this area where the water levels, we've sucked them down in the aquifer system over 100 feet in the last 20, 30 years. And at least for that part, lower Silver Creek and that part kind of, it's going to be west of the Silvies River, the lake is no longer the discharge area for the natural flow system. This area has become a big sink, if you will, or a hole. If I had noises, we could make big sucking sounds to kind of help amplify the issue there. But the study on the table over there, there's two documents there, and we'll leave them. We want to have one copy here. I'm not sure who the best person to send it home with is, but there are some contour maps, I think, in there that show these. It looks like a bullseye, just like you'd see a bullseye on a topographic map of a mountain. This is the groundwater decline, the hole that we've dug there from all the pumping over the years.
So that is actually being affected, the level of that lake is being affected by the groundwater being taken out.
Yeah, the groundwater, again, doesn't discharge to the lake, and to be clear, I don't know that we have a lot of evidence that groundwater discharged efficiently to the lake, like in a big spring complex. Remember, the lake bed sediments themselves in that part of the basin are very fine-grained, and so groundwater doesn't move vertically up or down through that system very easily. But certainly the gradient, you know, from high pressure to low pressure has been reversed in that particular area. Yes?
So it sounds like there won't be any, even if a good irrigation well is found, there won't be any new permits for irrigation water allowed in southern Marion County, right?
That would be the proposal, that moving forward with the classification process, future groundwater use would be limited to those exempt uses that we talked about at the end.
What about the city of Seneca? Is there any concern they should have about if they added 200 or 300 residents?
Yeah, if that's a concern, and you folks would know better than we would, I would bring that up and raise it. And there's an opportunity through the classification that a amount of water could be set aside for municipal use for Seneca, or municipal use in general in the basin. So those are kind of those special carve-outs. We want to manage the resource. We don't want to make the situation any worse. But we still want to afford people flexibility to deal with things in the future that, frankly, today we can't foresee what's coming. You know, solar projects are kind of a new thing. It was wind, 15, 20 years ago. Solar is increasing today. I don't know how much water they need. They need some for mixing cement and dust control and everything. Mining, lithium mining. Those are things, if you have ore resources in a particular area of the state, and we have concerns about groundwater and we want to classify, do you want a special carve out for precious metal extraction down the road? Those are things to think about, and it's easier to deal with those up front. These are rules, and they can be changed in the future through another rule process. So if something happens 20 years from now that we did not foresee, and we need to change those rules so management of water can change, we can certainly revisit that. The rules are not set in stone. It can be a slow process to fix it. I mentioned earlier the Division 10 rules that Kelly and I are updating were last updated in 1990, 33 years ago. So it takes a lot of staff time and staff energy to update these things. We have a lot of rule divisions that are in need of update, but in emergency situations, you know, things can be dealt with like that. Yes?
Do you have any data that relates to precipitation and groundwater levels over time?
The data exists, and we're part of the basin study. Amanda Garcia with the USGS kind of ran that part of the study. I think one of the reports is the water budget report that goes into a lot of that information in detail. And of course, we're looking at, I forget how many decades she looked at, but when we talk about the water budgets, those are numbers that are averaged over several decades, so we can come up with some best estimates over time. As you well know, the variability from year to year is high.
Following what Jack was saying, I know that he's got a well out here that he can't use because he determines it's in the Harney Valley or Harney Basin. What are you, besides not letting us or anybody up in the uplands drill a well for groundwater, what are you doing in the Harney Basin to generate groundwater?
So none of what we're going to do is going to increase the amount of groundwater. Really the intent with classification is to stop the bleeding. Let's not make the problem any worse. And so can we go to one of the slides that has a DivGAC in it? Right there. So this black hatchet area here, we've already classified groundwater for exempt uses only. So since 2016, we haven't issued any new permits for groundwater use in that basin.
You also mentioned 3 times that you're over pumping in the Harney Basin.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything to stop that? Is there a law or a rule in place where you can take the guy that in 2015 put in a 360 acre pivot that says, hey, you're out?
That's the critical.
Is that happening?
Yeah, it's not happening yet. We're starting down that path with this same rule process. So the rules that we're talking about updating, the Division 512 rules for the Malheur Lakes Basin, are going to have a bunch of plugins, if you will. One of those plugins is the classification that we're talking about tonight, and it may look like an expansion of that to this whole orange area, the study boundary. We've already done it in the black captured area. It may expand out to that orange area. All that does is stop the problem from getting worse. In order to slow those rates of decline that we saw, we're going to have to reduce the amount of groundwater pumping that's happening. That can be done through the CREP program that I talked about. It can be done through voluntary agreements amongst groundwater users, or the state can mandate it through the critical groundwater area process. And that's going to be a fairly slow process, several years to get through it. But that's a tool that we have used in the Umatilla Basin to protect the senior groundwater users from the effects of overpumping by the juniors, basically.
I'll ask you one more question.
Sure.
Or not question, but the reason I asked that question about precipitation in relationship to groundwater, there was a fellow over in Pineville who did a study about is the surface water, and the surface water does become groundwater and it lays around like that. So the interesting deal he did is he couldn't figure out why it was the reservoir, Pineville Reservoir wasn't filling up when the precipitation over the long period of time is pretty constant. And the fact that the reservoir wasn't getting as full as it was the fact that the vegetation, juniper, over-vegetated forests, were trans-evaporating that water so fast that it made that much difference in his study. It was very eye-opening to see that the lack of surface water no longer available to that reservoir. And if it's not available to the reservoir, it wouldn't be available for groundwater either. So that's the reason I asked that question.
It's a great point, and there are many studies that are being done, and just a couple of them have finished up. It's not only the vegetation, but guess what? It's getting warmer. And I'm sure those of you who've been up here a long time, I suspect your growing season maybe starts a little earlier and maybe runs a little longer on an average year up here. And we're seeing deviations from historical data. You know, we get the same amount of rain, but we're getting less stream flow. Why is that? Well, the evapotranspiration, evaporation from the land surface and the plants transpiring more, native stuff, trees, willows, whatever, they're sucking up more water because they're active longer during the growing season, and temperatures tend to be warmer, and we're fighting that. And so it's chewing into our available water, which is another, even if we get average precipitation, less of that's available because the natural vegetation is sucking up more of it. So, yeah.
So as part of the, I think as part of the study, it was mentioned that groundwater is traveling from this valley down to Montana Valley. How long is that taking? Is that taking 10 years? Is that taking
Thousands of years. In the deep flow paths, some of the recharge, I'll simplify it for my purposes. There's shallow recharge, which will recharge and then discharge into the Sylvies or some of the smaller tributaries or some of your springs up here, probably within years, maybe within a season. Those are shallow, short flow paths from recharge. Some of that water that recharges, though, is going deep, and that's what the USGS estimated is coming into the lower basin, and I forget what that was, 80-some thousand acre feet, 40-some thousand acre feet of recharge from the uplands is getting into the lowlands down there. And so, again, some of that shallow recharge is supporting flows ultimately in the Silvies River. And the Silvies River, once it gets down through the canyon and starts to break out into the valley there near Burns, there's coarser sediment, and that's probably one of the key recharge areas for the lowlands, is water just naturally leaking out of the Silvies system and also being recharged from the flood irrigation that occurs down there as well. So any interruption of the shallow recharge or the deeper stuff will take a long time to manifest down there, but we're just, again, trying to stop the problem from getting worse.
So yes. The next follow-up question?
Yeah.
So if I drill a well, a deep well, and I start pumping water out, it wouldn't affect Harney County for 1,000 years?
Well, so there's some nuance there, right? So the water molecules take thousands of years to travel, but the pressure response can be much faster. So just like with a garden hose, right? When you turn on the water comes out the other end almost instantly if the hose is full. But that water molecule didn't travel from the beginning of the hose to the end of the hose instantaneously. The pressure response carried through. So if you start pumping up here in large quantities and reduce the pressure response, that groundwater flow path is now going, that groundwater is going to move slower through the system to get down there. So it can have a much faster impact than it would than just preventing that single water molecule from traveling that distance over that time. So your time values can vary, and we don't have a really good way of quantifying how quickly that impact would happen. So I don't have a good response for you, but it can happen much faster than thousands of years because of the pressure response.
You had a question in the back?
That was a similar question. In your maps and your graphs, do you show, I mean, obviously 25 years ago, the water table dropped off drastically. That's in certain area in Harney County. Is there any measurement the farther north you go? Is it reflected there, or is it not even affected up here, and down there we still have to drop off? Is there any measurement of that?
There is, and again, in the report, I can point you to it. We have some maps that show all the wells that were measured. There weren't a lot up here in the uplands, but the hydrograph that we showed there with water levels dropping off, that response is contained to a relatively small part of the lowland basin there. And there's reasons geologically. Those wells were drilled into recent volcanic deposits, cinders, coarse material, that when you drill a well, you can get several thousand gallons a minute out of it. But that area of cinders and coarse material was relatively small in extent, and it's surrounded by a lot more fine-grained material and rock of lower permeability. So over the tens of thousands of years, that system filled up, and we're mining it out very quickly because it's very productive. We can get big wells in there that pump a lot, but the surrounding geology is not feeding in enough water, and that's why we have the declines going on. When you look at the contour map of groundwater elevations around the basin, you'll see these bullseyes, and so the whole basin overall was going down a half a foot or so per year in the lowlands, but we have these areas of focused pumping where a lot of developments occurred, and that shows up as bullseyes on these maps, and that's where the bulk of the decline is going on. As you get up into the uplands up here, again, there's been very little groundwater development. I would say all the groundwater changes that are occurring up here today are likely just a result of climate trends, you know, wet years, dry years, long-term droughts, things like that. So I guess another way of saying that is the lowlands are not going to suck you dry up here. Yes?
When you had that chart that showed the drop-off, that drop-off was when most of those wells, the commercial wells, went into Harney County. Is that big? What they weren't here in the 50s. When did the bulk of them go?
A lot of the development occurred in the 80s, 90s. You know, generically across Oregon, big groundwater development was dependent upon power coming in and then pumping technology. You know, the line shaft turbine pumps can move a lot of water. And so most of the development occurred in, I think, the 80s and 90s, but we continued to issue permits out there until the 2010s, up until 2016, when we essentially classified it for those exempt uses only. And even after that, folks have time to kind of grow into water rights that we issued 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So we still had new development going on. It may still be going on down there in a much slower extent, but folks can have a window of time to kind of develop their permits and their uses, and that occurred down there as well.
So then, basically, what you're doing is you're restricting us up here so that they can have enough water down there and still maybe slow the process down.
Yeah, so again, the classification doesn't impact any of your existing uses up here today, so nothing will change up here today. What really is going to be impacted is future development. And there really isn't much groundwater up here to develop, but that would be further limited by this classification process.
So if Jack and Matt and Kenny here went in and put in a processing plant for beef, they're going to be out of luck.
They would be able to use up to 5,000 gallons a day for a commercial use, but if the classification is strictly for exempt uses only, that would be the limitation for them there. Yes?
How are the structures of the ground open water affected by this dropping water? Are we losing capacity to go back to where we were, or does it refill and the normal capacity remain?
We don't know. In areas where there's fine-grained sediment, you've heard the term subsidence. That's what happens when you mine out groundwater. So the Central Valley, California has seen tens of feet of land subsidence. As they remove water from the sediments, particularly if those sediments are fine-grained like silts and clays, you dewater those sediments and there's no more hydrostatic pressure to help keep them elevated, and they start to collapse on themselves, and you lose that pore space. And that is generally an irreversible trend. The Klamath Basin allegedly is starting to see some subsidence on the northern California, southern Oregon border there, because we've got groundwater declines occurring down there as well, and they've got some fine-grained sediments. We haven't seen any subsidence here. We haven't gone looking for it. It can be pretty subtle. But the cinder aquifer is an example at Weaver Springs. Something like that wouldn't normally collapse. It's more the fine-grained sediments, perhaps something under the lakes as an example, if over time.
Mine is just dealing with the city, but the city, I know, sends all its data about water usage into the state. Do you monitor or look at the cities and see what their usage is as part of the problem here?
I don't know if the study team looked at groundwater use across the study area, and so they probably did look at that. So public entities in the state are required to report their water use, and cities are one of those. So we get that data in our water use reporting system, and it's available to our scientists or the USGS to use for these types of studies.
So I can speak to that a little bit. So the study broke it down by irrigation use and non-irrigation use. And from a percentage standpoint, it came out to, in the Harney Basin as a whole, so the whole orange area on that map, we were looking at about 95% of usage was irrigation, and 5% was all other types of use. So that would include municipalities, commercial, industrial, etc. Domestic, that includes exempt uses, stop watering, etc.
We drove 6 hours, you gotta have more questions. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you for coming out. I know you're all busy.
I got one more question.
Okay, good.
What's your solution? to the problem in the Harney Basin. Your professional opinion and solution that's going to make this thing work.
There really isn't a silver bullet for this. And so I'm going to dance around the question a little bit. But, you know, management of any natural resource is not easy. You guys deal with timber, you deal with juniper, you deal with wolves, all kinds of things. And as you're aware, there's not a lot of black and white in those types of things. Some people may have black and white opinions on them, for sure. But clearly we have to reduce groundwater pumping in some parts of the lowlands in the Harney Valley down there. How that happens, luckily we have some good tools to do that. We also have the hammer, the critical groundwater area designation to do that if folks can't figure out a way how to do it on their own through a voluntary process or the CREP program there. But without us stepping in and managing, and our water law says we need to step in and do this, our commission needs to do this, we literally will pump these systems dry and then everybody's out of water and all of that irrigated agriculture will go away. There are no additional sources. Similar to you folks up here, we don't have a Columbia River 10 miles to the north that maybe with some money we could pump. What you see is what we have to work with, and we have to figure out ways to work with that. And we're being challenged not only by our development, you know, from our species, but from the changes to our climate. You know, our uplands are growing vegetation. Forest management is impacting things. Fires are impacting water availability. And so there's a lot of different competing interests for water, and trying to balance that is a real challenge. So, yes?
Would there be a chance that there would be say a variance normal of groundwater to be maintained in your management process? Would that be a target? In other words, where are your groundwaters? You need to stabilize it. What's the range? Would that be a management tool?
That's what we've been asked to provide the groundwater users with in the lowlands. And PTW, permissible total withdrawal. Still learning this, Tim is honest, we mix up the words all the time. How much is permissible to get us to a water level rate of change that's acceptable? And, you know, the legislature didn't give us a number. They didn't say 3 inches a year going down is okay, Ivan, stick to that. Once you get to that, we're good. They didn't say that we have to get to 0. They gave us a term called reasonably stable groundwater levels as kind of one of the policies that our commission needs to maintain. And that's going to mean different things to different people. And so we're working within those constraints, but it's evident that some of these areas where we've seen a lot of groundwater development are going to have to reduce that use by, in some cases, probably a fairly high percentage. And that has immediate and very real and meaningful impacts to those producers down there. Okay, thank you. Appreciate everybody coming out, and if you have other questions, Alexandria, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, just a quick thank you to everyone for coming out this evening, and I just want to flag up here, for those of you who like to use your cell phones, if you scan that blue box there to the right, it'll pull up our website that has all of the materials related to this rulemaking on it. I also put a code there that you can also type into your phones. You can take a picture. This PowerPoint is going to be posted on our website, so you can also access all of the materials we presented to you this evening. And the groundwater study that we went through this evening as well, there's actually a whole page on our website that has the 6 reports that were mentioned, all the data available. If you ever have any questions for us, you're welcome to shoot our staff an email. You're welcome to call, and we can point you to all these resources. But there's a ton of information out there for you, and we're happy to help connect you to the resources that you need to get your questions answered. So thank you again for coming out this evening, and you guys get home safe.